Today for Devotions with Daniella, we are reading from Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. World War II and the need for quite a few good women. Patriarchy is oppressive, cruel, destructive, inefficient, and sometimes quite absurd. A few years after the Great Depression, the editors of True Story magazine faced a bit of a conundrum. How could a magazine that had spent years villainizing women workers in scandalous, true, but really fictional, stories help get women into the workplace? True Story and other confessional magazines had made their money by weaving lurid tales of women who went seeking adventure or a career, two things decidedly reserved for men, and were met with infertility, miscarriage, divorce, even sexual assault. Brought to the brink of absolute ruin, the women would repent for their misdeeds of ambition or audacity, and then were shown grace and mercy with the opportunity to embrace the life they were meant to have, that of a happy, docile, and grateful wife and mother. This formula worked quite well for providing women readers with scandal and excitement during their often long and predictable days caring for home and children, while also helping to make sure that they appreciated the fact that this was their only thrill. But it sure did not work for the Magazine Bureau, a government office created in 1942 to help coordinate war coverage and propaganda in mostly women's magazines like Women's Day, Ladies' Home Journal, and True Story. More than 11 million men went overseas from the United States to fight in World War II, leaving a severe deficit in manpower for non-combat military support positions. Jobs in munitions factories and many other occupations throughout the war industry, just when the need for manufacturing production increased. Desperate to fill these vacancies, companies targeted people they were not used to recruiting: women and people of color. It wasn't difficult to get Black and Latinx workers to line up for jobs. Their communities had long been excluded from the higher pay and employment security of skilled factory work, and many leapt at the chance. The harder part was convincing factory owners, managers, and employees to work alongside people of color. Many white workers protested, and riots broke out over the new workplace diversity. But there were not enough workers of color to fill all the open positions. Even if there had been, people of color would probably have wanted to keep their jobs after the war ended, and the white soldiers returned home and looked for work. The U.S. government needed a workforce that would happily give up their employment once the war was over. Officials found those potential employees in their own homes: women, in particular, married white women. Married women, demonized for working during the Great Depression because they obviously didn't have to work, became the ideal candidates for wartime employment for the very same reason. They didn't have to work. Not motivated by personal need or ambition, married women would work both because doing so was their patriotic duty and also to support their husbands' efforts overseas. Furthermore, they would, it was assumed, happily give up their jobs once their men returned home. And women did go to work. 6.5 million women entered the workforce during the war years, with nearly 1 in 4 married women working outside the home. Not only were women working, they were working in roles that had been closed to them before the war. According to Maureen Honey in Creating Rosie the Riveter, by the end of 1943, women comprised 34.2% of all ammunition workers, 10.6% of those in steel production, 10% of all personnel in shipping, 8% of railroad workers, and 40% of people employed in the aircraft industry. Women were an essential force in the domestic war effort. So how do you encourage women to work after having spent the last decade encouraging them not to work, while also making sure they won't want to work for any longer than the government needs them to? Well, getting magazines like True Story to stop telling women that employment would only lead to divorce, infertility, and sexual assault was a start. The Magazine Bureau started reaching out to publishers to coordinate stories. It used its magazine War Guide to help shape coverage and to provide tips to popular women's magazines on how to help improve social opinions about women workers. First to go was the idea that women who were engaged in war work would meet the scandalous fate that many women had met in the past. True story confessionals. Officials at the Bureau wrote, "May we suggest that care be observed not to create the impression that women engaged in any phase of war work, whether with the military services, in civilian war agencies, or in war industry, are more tempted or more susceptible to extramarital dalliance than others." The confessional magazines were asked to tweak their formulas to inspire women workers to find excitement in doing their patriotic duty, as well as deeper and more satisfying love in supporting their men overseas, instead of the death and destruction they had foretold in their past stories. Loath to completely give up their reliable model of sin, ruin, redemption, however, True Story created two new story types: the selfless woman who would find satisfaction, joy, and love in working to help bring men home sooner, and the selfish woman who only worked for personal advancement and was met with the usual heartbreak, miscarriage, and assault. Here's an example in Make Believe Marriage, published in 1944. A wife struggles with balancing the needs of her marriage and her work supporting the war effort, but she takes pride in knowing she's supporting the soldiers and strengthened the knowledge that as soon as the war is over, she can go back to being a housewife. By contrast, the selfish woman working as a surgical nurse in A Solemn Promise, published that same year, seeks only to fulfill her ambitions, stating, "At 23, I had no life beyond the great walls of mercy, desired none. My work was meat and drink to my soul." She falls in love with and marries a patient, but her commitment to her career causes her marriage to fall apart, and she miscarries their baby. She is left lamenting, "We might have prolonged the rapture of our honeymoon indefinitely had I stayed in the shining little rooms and devoted my time to making a real home." Many of the government's attempts to recruit and keep women workers for the war effort enforced this same dichotomy. Women who had never expected to work had to be recruited and kept happy while working, but they also had to leave their jobs as soon as men returned. To that end, working conditions for many women suddenly became much better than they had been before the war. Recognizing that women would still be expected to care for their families and homes while working, factory owners started adding daycare centers. Facilities were adjusted for women's comforts, and training programs were created just for them. To protect women's supposed sensibilities and purity, they were primarily hired at facilities that had few or no male coworkers, outside of supervisors and managers, who were still predominantly male. Fearful that low wages typically paid to women would keep employers from firing them when the war ended, unions pressed for competitive wages for women. These gains were often denied, and most women still earned a good deal less than men, but their wages did increase once unions got involved. Women were living a workplace dream they had never seen before and wouldn't see again. To stave off massive unemployment once the war concluded, officials began preparing for the millions of soldiers who would need work when they returned, mapping out a plan as early as the beginning of the war. All studies, surveys, and strategy meetings conducted to work on the issue of post-war employment were based on the idea that only workers who counted were men, in particular, white men. No strategies were put in place with how to deal with the future of women workers, beyond how to most quickly and easily transition them out of work to make room for men. The U.S. government commissioned studies on existing attitude towards women workers and what should be done with them when the war ended. Not content to just gauge public opinion, government officials aimed to shape it. Propaganda was targeted to women, like that developed by the Magazine Bureau, but pamphlets and short films were also produced to mold male opinions on working women. One pamphlet commissioned from the American Historical Association by the War Department, titled, "Do You Want Your Wife to Work After the War?" was a discussion guide of sorts that endeavored to get GIs thinking about how they would handle the presence of women workers when they returned home. Covering historical opinions, the pamphlet highlighted flaws in past hostility toward women workers, while reaffirming how understandable those attitudes were, in order to soften men's views toward women's employment. It featured a fictionalized discussion between two soldiers on the pros and cons of women workers. One soldier argued that while most women were happy to be wives and mothers, many also needed the excitement and purpose of outside employment. He talked about the financial benefits and security of having a wife who was also bringing in income. The second soldier argued that women would be in direct competition with returning soldiers for employment, and that they would abandon their wifely and motherly duties in order to keep a job that should go to a man. How about competition from these women that are staying on the job to support guys like you? The second soldier argued. They're going to make it harder for me to do it my way. The debate on the surface seemed to evenly represent the issue. If we ignore the fact that the entire debate is situated within the needs, desires, and opinions of men. The final section of the pamphlet, titled "Some Attempts to Solve the Women Problem," lists possible ways to deal with women workers after the war, including those who wanted to keep working. Possible solutions include treating housework and child rearing more like a profession and establishing training programs on household management. Another is to pay women not to work. The prospect of women staying in the workplace so long as men helped them with household chores in order to lighten their burden is briefly floated, but immediately dismissed as too upsetting to the traditional scheme of things. While the pamphlet was initially framed as an impartial document in support of the war effort, the American History Association now acknowledges that it and other organizations like it were part of the war machine intended to shape public opinion instead of merely gauging or reflecting it. The AHA admits that it tailored its pamphlets to paint an idealized image of a post-war world that was essentially free of minorities, where women happily moved out of the factories and back into the kitchen, and where America would largely dominate the world stage. I'm sure that many in the War Office congratulated themselves on the success of their propaganda campaigns and celebrated them as proof of the suggestible nature of women. But it is likely that a large percentage of the 6.5 million women who worked did so because they needed to support themselves and their families. Perhaps they had always wanted to work but had previously been denied decent paying jobs. Regardless of why they started, once the war was over, many women wanted to keep working. The efforts of the U.S. government may have helped cement public opinion overall against working women after the war. Studies show that when asked what to do with women workers post-war, 48% of respondents said fire them, and an additional 36% said fire them unless they have dependents or are war widows or there are plenty of jobs. The government was far less successful in getting the women who were doing the work to eagerly give it up. Studies and polls conducted in 1944 of working women showed that 75 to 80% of them wanted to keep their jobs after the war ended. Apparently, they decided to risk the possibility of divorce, infertility, and death that True Story had warned them of for daring to want to work for any other reason than to bring soldiers home. Regardless of how vital the work of women had been to the war effort, the only jobs that the U.S. government and factory owners cared about saving after the war were the jobs of men, even if a large percentage of the men returning had never worked in plants or factories. 1 million women were fired as the war ended. 2 million more left the workplace, and many were funneled into lower-paying women's roles. White women were steered toward clerical work and lower-paying, low-skilled manufacture work. Black women were placed in domestic service and laundries. Women who tried to stay in other fields were not immediately fired, found that the daycare services and welcoming work environments disappeared. Unions weren't interested in protecting their wages, and they were stripped of the promotions they had worked for. Often, they were demoted to the lowest paying and lowest skilled positions in their plants and factories. As women were shoved out of higher paid positions, many of which hadn't existed pre-war, especially in factories and plants built for the war effort and those utilizing newly developed wartime technologies, men quickly moved into them and up the employment ladders that women had helped build. Returning soldiers who failed to land these promising positions were not left out to dry. The GI Bill provided education, training, financial relief, home loans, small business loans, and more. Between those benefits and the new skills and businesses that had been opened up by wartime production and with the financial support of the U.S. government, many men found themselves on the path to financial security, even prosperity. Enrollment in college, which prior to the war had been a place still mostly reserved for wealthy and socially connected sons, skyrocketed, as did home ownership. Almost half of all veterans started their own businesses, and a quarter of them were successful. Women were almost completely cut out of GI benefits. Of the 8 million World War II veterans who used the GI Bill, only about 65,000 were women. That's 0.008%. Meanwhile, the average Black veteran found that the GI Bill simply returned him to his lower economic caste. College age was offered to Black veterans, but it was moot. The vast majority of U.S. colleges and universities refused to accept Black students, and those that did accepted so small a number that most Black veterans were unable to use the tuition benefits. Homeowners assistance was of even less use to Black vets, since banks refused to work with Black buyers, and cities redlined Black families into neighborhoods designed to keep the returns on their investments as low as possible. The GI Bill was legislation designed to benefit only white men. Even unemployment assistance worked against Black veterans. When they returned home to find that among the new promising jobs, the only positions offered to them were the most dangerous, the lowest skilled, and the lowest paid, they were forced to accept them. If they turned down these hazardous and poorly compensated jobs, they were reported to the Department of Veterans Affairs and their benefits were cut, leaving them with nothing. By the way, when you get out of the military, you can get 6 months of unemployment in any state in America. If they turned down these In nearly every instance of notable social progress and opportunity for women and people of color, we see immense efforts put forth by white men to build further guarantees of their power into those advances. Many still view World War II as a turning point for working women because it was an era when more women worked than ever before. And it's true that many women continued to work after the war, helping to normalize the idea of women in the workplace. But when we look at the huge effort and expense the government expended on developing propaganda, as well as legislation like the GI Bill, still so celebrated today, we can also see that it was a time when sexist and racist norms were modernized and cemented into the post-war economy. Due to the combined efforts of the federal government and business owners, the rigid definition of women's work was scaled up to ensure that even if it could accommodate rising numbers of female employees, even if those low-paid and low-skilled jobs were not the ones they sought, people of color were once again forced into jobs and neighborhoods that continued to guarantee the conditions of poverty they had always known. And white men were given more opportunities than ever before to access highly skilled and well-paying work, education, secure housing, and entrepreneurial opportunity, simply because they were white men. Check out Mediocre. You can scan that and get a copy right here.